you ever feel that quick spark of contempt rise in your chest when someone tells you what to do? As if a part of you wants to stand up immediately, fold your arms, and announce that you are too intelligent to be ordered around, that your mind was built for higher problems than schedules, checklists, and instructions. And do you notice how that spark often burns your own chances before it singes anyone else? How the very refusal to obey a well-chosen order becomes the reason your ideas never leave the notebook, the reason your talent keeps circling the runway instead of touching down and building something that breathes. Do you ever recognize that much of what you call independence is, in practice, a fear of submitting to any structure outside your mood, and that this fear costs you far more than any temporary concession to discipline ever would? You might be smart, yes, but are you so smart that you are now allergic to apprenticeship, allergic to repetition, allergic to rules that exist to train your power rather than shrink it? You may think you are born to lead, to innovate, to disrupt, yet you cannot lead what you have never learned to obey. You cannot innovate inside a craft whose fundamentals you refuse to practice, and you cannot disrupt a system you do not first understand down to its bolts, hinges, and hidden levers. The question is not whether you are too smart to obey. The question is whether you are smart enough to choose what to obey and for how long, because mastery always begins as chosen obedience directed toward a worthy aim. Niccolo Machiavelli would smirk at the modern ego that confuses disobedience with strength, because he knew that a prince who disobeys reality will soon obey the conqueror who does not. He lived in a world where beautiful ideals did not stop knives, where wishful thinking did not prevent siege towers from rolling across fields, and he recorded a simple law that still governs your daily life, even if your battleground is a calendar rather than a city wall. If you do not discipline your impulses will discipline you, and what looks like freedom in the morning becomes regret by nightfall, every time. The hard truth is that Machiavelli's realism is not cruelty. It is mercy for anyone willing to look directly at consequence, because once you accept that the world does not bend for your feelings, you gain an immense power to bend yourself into a shape that can move the world. Friedrich Nietzsche would take that same theme and escalate it into a demand that would frighten most people, because he insisted that the highest obedience is not obedience to another person at all. It is obedience to the deepest command of your own becoming. Become who you are, he wrote, not as a slogan for a t-shirt, but as an order to the self that can only be fulfilled by submitting to difficulty, by courting friction, until your character hardens into a blade you can trust. Nietzsche was not impressed by cleverness that collapses in the first windstorm. He admired a human being who could look necessity in the face and say, "I will organize my life so that the necessary becomes mine to choose." That is obedience, but it is a sovereign obedience, an allegiance you swear to your future, rather than to every passing authority that barks at you. And then there is Leonardo da Vinci, the most radiant example you can summon when your pride tries to tell you that obeying is beneath you. The apprentice Leonardo obeyed the discipline of the workshop long before the world obeyed his genius. He ground pigments, stretched canvases, swept floors, sketched anatomy late into the night under candlelight. Not because anyone forced him, but because he understood that a mind which refuses craft remains a spectator to its own potential. He learned rules so deeply that he could later bend them with elegance, and we mistake the elegance for effortless magic, when in fact it is the visible tip of a mountain of chosen obedience to technique, to observation, to patient revision. If the greatest engineer artist of the West could submit his talent to rigorous order, what exactly are you protecting when you refuse to do the same? Do you ever notice how the phrase, "I am too smart to obey," often hides in more polite clothing. It presents itself as, "That task is beneath me," or "I work best when I am inspired," or "These routines are for people who cannot improvise." Yet when you look at your results with clear eyes, you see the cost of that posture everywhere. Late projects, half-read books, abandoned skills, a body that knows you only show up when you feel like it, a portfolio that reads like a directory of bright beginnings with no conclusion. Intelligence without obedience to a plan is a weather vane on a cathedral, spinning in every gust and pointing nowhere for long. You may protest that obedience breeds conformity, that it crushes creativity, that many of history's dullest minds followed rules with lifeless precision. That is true when obedience is blind, when it is forced, when it is given to small men with small aims who love power more than truth. But chosen obedience to a great aim is the opposite of conformity. It is the training camp of originality. Machiavelli did not advise princes to obey gossip or courtly fashion. He urged them to obey the conditions on the ground, to wield structure as a tactic against chaos, to submit ego to outcomes that actually secure the realm. Nietzsche did not preach servility. He preached the conquest of one's own weakness, the glorious burden of becoming a lawgiver to oneself. Leonardo did not bow to superstition. He obeyed the evidence of his eye and hand and experiment, the discipline that allowed his curiosity to map the veins of leaves and the flight of birds and the gears of imagined machines. So the real question is not, are you too smart to obey, but are you smart enough to choose your commander? If you won't choose, someone else will. A boss who fills your calendar with tasks that fatten his metrics, an algorithm that slices your attention into confetti, a crowd that drags your standards toward the lowest common laugh. Choosing your commander means writing a code you respect so much that you are willing to kneel before it each morning, and then rising from that kneel sharper than when you woke. Your code can be a schedule you honor when the bed calls you back, a training plan you follow when excuses bloom, a study regime you protect from the noise of lesser urgencies. It is not obedience to an external tyrant. It is obedience to the version of you who will starve if you keep feeding the present with your future's rations. You may ask, but what if the person ordering me around is an actual superior, a manager, a teacher, a client, a mentor, and what if they are wrong? Then Machiavelli appears with a practical counsel that saves careers, reputations, and sometimes lives. Obey the structure unless it violates your ethics or ruins your mission. Obey while you gather leverage. Obey while you learn their playbook so that when you challenge it, you do not look like a teenager rebelling for the thrill, but like a strategist offering a superior plan. In other words, obey as reconnaissance, obey as camouflage, obey as foundation for a better attack. The world is littered with smart rebels who lost because they never studied the fort they tried to storm. The prince who survives is often the one who tolerates what is needed until the moment arrives to replace it with what is true. You may ask, but what if obedience to my own code hardens me into a rigid fanatic who cannot adapt? Then Nietzsche returns and demands that you obey your own becoming more than your current identity. The code is a floor, not a prison. When you feel the inner order has become vanity, when you notice you are worshiping your routine instead of using it, change the plan. True self-rule is not stubbornness. It is fidelity to growth, and growth includes revision. The point is not to obey yesterday's self forever. The point is to obey whatever present discipline brings you closer to the self you are building, even if that means discarding a method that once served you. You may ask, but how do I know which orders to accept? and which to refuse, especially when I am young and the world is loud. Here, Leonardo offers a gentler, quieter instruction. Obey what increases contact with reality. Obey what multiplies your skill across domains. Obey what expands your patience for detail and your appetite for truth. If an order makes your hand steadier, your observation finer, your capacity to iterate larger, it is a good order. If an order shrinks your range, numbs your curiosity, starves your integrity, it is a bad order. Set this test inside you and consult it before every yes. Recall this as well. Obedience does not humiliate you when you choose it in service of a noble aim. It humbles you, and humility is the instrument that lets a gifted mind accept feedback, absorb correction, and exceed its original limits. A proud mind sees correction as insult. A humble mind sees it as map, and a humble mind that obeys a good map outruns pride every decade. Machiavelli's letters in exile read like notes from a man who obeyed the truth even when the truth favored his enemies. And in doing so, he produced a manual that still gives people clarity 5 centuries later. Nietzsche's notebooks testify to a will that obeyed the demand to write despite pain, to think despite isolation, to craft sentences that cut through pretense like wire through silk. Leonardo's sketches show what happens when obedience to the eye, to the hand, to proportion, to experiment, transforms a man into a bridge between art and engineering. Do you think you are too smart to obey a simple morning routine that would rescue your mind from chaos? Then look at your afternoons and count how many times you replay the same failure, the same avoidance, the same cheap reward, and ask how much intelligence you have actually preserved by refusing to be boring for 1 hour at dawn. Do you think you are too creative to obey the fundamentals of your craft? Then ask why your output stutters whenever enthusiasm dips, and whether a craftsman less gifted than you, but more obedient to practice, is slowly overtaking you while you congratulate yourself for potential. Do you think you are too independent to obey a mentor's corrections? Then recall that Leonardo once worked in another man's workshop, that Machiavelli once followed the orders of a republic, and that Nietzsche once obeyed the daily march that kept his body moving enough for his mind to blaze. You may have noticed that the times you obeyed well did not weaken you. They armored you. The study blocks you protected, built a chamber in your brain where noise cannot enter. The gym sessions you did not skip carved a memory into your muscles that tells you, I can do hard things even when I do not want to. The money you saved when your friends chased novelty bought you the leverage to say no to work that insults your values. Every act of chosen obedience compounds into freedom, and every refusal to obey what matters compounds into invisible chains you will discover only when a crisis arrives and you have no discipline to spend. Ask yourself whether the phrase, too smart to obey, is anchoring you to the one strategy that guarantees a small life, the strategy of refusing to submit to anything, which leaves you submitting to everything. A mind that brags about independence, while its habits are enslaved to impulse, is like a beggar in a crown, loud and broke. Machiavelli would tell you to tally costs, to measure which obedience buys you strength and which obedience sells your strength to another man's goal. Nietzsche would tell you to examine whether the orders you follow are spoken by fear, by laziness, by the desire to be admired without paying price, or by the deeper voice that commands you to rise, to suffer in noble ways, to carve meaning where comfort offers none. Leonardo would tell you to go to your table, open your notebook, and draw the frigging hand 10 times until the hand in your mind matches the hand on the page, because that is the difference between a dreamer and a master. There is another kind of obedience you are avoiding, the obedience to the present moment. You keep trying to obey fantasies about your future self, instead of obeying the small task in front of you that would give your future self a chance to exist. You tell yourself that when you have more time, more money, more support, more faith, you will finally be the man you can describe so beautifully to a camera or a friend. Meanwhile, the dishes sit in the sink, the spreadsheet waits untouched, the call you promised to return grows colder. The chapter remains a title. You would not tolerate a soldier who disobeys the order to advance because he is thinking about a perfect army 10 years from now, so stop tolerating it in yourself. Obey the next right thing now, then the next, until your progress forces your doubt to negotiate rather than dictate. Do not confuse obedience with surrender to mediocrity. When Machiavelli tells a prince to obey the terrain, he is teaching the prince how to conquer. When Nietzsche tells you to obey the demands of your own becoming, he is teaching you how to make a life you do not secretly despise. When Leonardo obeys the disciplines of painting and anatomy, he is teaching you how to break the rules with credibility, because you can restore them at will. Obedience to what elevates you is the doorway to the exact independence you keep trying to steal without paying. You will meet people who scoff at this, who will call any obedience weakness, who will confuse rebellion with depth. Let them. A rebel who cannot ship is a child with a slogan. A conformist who ships garbage is a bureaucrat with a stamp. You are neither. You are a builder. You obey a plan that gives your talent muscle and flight. You disobey the small masters who try to hire your days for minimum wage. You obey the fact that if you do not set the tone of your morning, someone else will, and their tone will be cheaper than your purpose. You disobey the voice that wants to scroll first and sweat later. You obey the schedule that makes you hard to ignore. You disobey the party that would trade your Sunday for a hangover. You obey the quiet voice that asks you to sit with boredom until concentration appears. When doubt returns, as it always does, remember how each of these men navigated it. Machiavelli endured exile, ridicule, and danger, yet obeyed the discipline of writing every day, turning humiliation into a handbook for those brave enough to read without flinching. Nietzsche endured illness, loneliness, and misunderstanding, yet obeyed the discipline of thought so fiercely that his pages still detonate complacency in minds not yet anesthetized by comfort. Leonardo endured delays, distractions, and human patrons who wanted miracles on schedule, yet obeyed the discipline of curiosity with such devotion that even his unfinished works hum with life centuries later. They were not too smart to obey. They were too smart not to. So ask yourself again, with the sun sinking or rising and your excuses waiting like pets at the door, are you too smart to obey? Or are you finally smart enough to choose what to obey and smart enough to refuse everything else? Will you kneel for an hour to a code you wrote so that you can stand for decades without asking permission? Will you pick up the brush, the book, the barbell, the business plan, and serve it until it can serve you back? Will you stop outsourcing your will to mood, to crowds, to appetites, and draft your own orders so cleanly that the only way to disobey them is to admit in plain speech that you have chosen smallness? If your pride still resists, call it by its smaller name, fear. You are not afraid of obedience, you are afraid of accountability. Because if you obey and still fail, then you cannot hide your weakness behind the fog of improvisation. Good. Let the fog burn. Obey anyway. Fail honestly. Learn precisely. Adjust ruthlessly. Repeat patiently. This is the alchemy. The day you do this is the day you become less impressed with the identity you perform and more impressed with the identity you are constructing. That day can be today.
Do this, and you will know a very specific kind of quiet that noisy men never experience. The quiet of a conscience aligned to a method. The quiet of a body that trusts its pilot. The quiet of a calendar that speaks your language. The quiet of a bank account that reflects resolved choices rather than impulse purchases. The quiet of a craft that hums under your hands, because the hands finally show up when summoned. People will call you disciplined, as though they are naming a rare defect. Smile and let them. You are not too smart to obey. You were smart enough to refuse the fake freedoms that kept you smaller than your gift, and by that refusal, you will have earned the only obedience that deserves the name, allegiance to the future you sworn in your own handwriting. Now place your phone face down, choose the next small order, and obey it. Close the tab that flatters your restlessness. Open the file that frightens you. If the command feels almost military, good, because your life is worth fighting for. If you need a final word, borrow one from the only commanders you should let inside your council chamber. Machiavelli would say, "Obey reality or reality will rule you." Nietzsche would say, "Obey your becoming until the world hears its footsteps." Leonardo would say, "Obey the craft until the craft obeys you. Then get up and go to work. The rest of the argument is what you will build."